just going?
Yeah, we're just going. We'll at least wait for this to come through.
I'm not sure if it started.
I think it has. What's that?
Yeah, click on that button.
Change that. Oh, yeah,
Oh,
we're good.
hey, Mike. Cool.
Hello, Mike. All right, we're good. We are live. Can I? Okay, yeah, there we go. Oh, we can see it.
Perfect.
All right. Oh.
Hello, everyone. Hope you guys are doing good. Who's ever tuning in? I see we have 0 viewers up on the top right.
Yeah.
We had a good
ComCode.
It's probably very loud.
Yeah, it was. I saw it. That should get. Oh wait, no, that's wrong.
No, that should be right, shouldn't it?
No, we're AMSec and CARSec. Excellent.
Cool.
Beautiful.
So yeah, as you can see, this is the CARSec and AMSec second Lunch and Learn.
Day 2.
Last week we had Kaya and Mike doing DFIR and MedSec.
MedSec.
And we're back this week.
Back. Doing it on a bi-weekly basis.
Yeah.
Ignore the comically large mouse.
Yeah, so I'm William Alber. Currently going to Champlain College, rising senior right now, majoring in computer networking and cybersecurity. I'm working on the CARSec program for ComCode, and my background is in networking, software development, and a lot of hardware repair.
I am Austin Grupposo. I'm a rising junior at Champlain College in digital forensics and cybersecurity. I'm working on the AMSec project, which is Additive Manufacturing, fancy word for 3D printing. My background is in all sorts of government and compliance, but specifically I've been focusing on CMMC, which we'll talk a little bit more about later.
Nice. So yeah, CARSec. Talked about a lot about last week about the sort of ins and outs of connected cars and like the basics of actually like hacking into a car and taking control of it. And this week I'm going to move into a little bit more of the regulation side of things and how those factor into the sort of landscape and ecosystem that we're seeing now for automated and connected cars as a whole. So this chart that you can see right here is just a sort of overview of where the different regulations and standards sort of overlap with each other. And this was created because although there are a lot of regulations, you can't just be compliant with one of them in order to simply stay compliant with the regulation. So for instance, you see the SAE J3061, that talks a lot about the sort of safety standards that cars have, and it doesn't cover anything about the concept of a product or the maintenance or the decommissioning of it. So you need to also supplement that with something like ISO 26262 or ISO 21434 whenever that releases. And as far as the other three following that, there's WP29, which is a part of the World Forum for the Harmonization of Vehicle Regulations. And this is a part of the United Nations. It's a group within it that meets a couple times every year, and they just kind of talk about the different areas that need to be focused on in order to keep vehicles that are on the road safe. So they're not creating regulations as much as they are creating guidelines for automobile manufacturers to follow. And there are 3 main ones that get talked about a lot in terms of WP29, and that's number 156, 157, and 158. And these cover things like how software gets updated and how that's managed in terms of over-the-air updates that we're seeing in newer cars, and also in terms of like taking your car to the dealership when there's a recall or just it needs a new level of firmware within it. Number 157 talks about the lane keeping assist feature within cars and how that can have a lot of issues that can lead to a lot of problematic things on the road. So they need to make sure that manufacturers aren't cutting corners when manufacturing and sort of designing the software behind that, because a lot of different companies use different software for them. So making sure that one company isn't making a software that's a lot worse than another company, because that can lead to a lot of issues down the line. If some cars are causing issues with lane keeping assist and others are working flawlessly, there's going to lead to a lot more accidents on the road. And number 158 that I talked about covers all the devices that aid driver awareness on the road. So that's things like blind spot warning and like a backup camera. Just anything that you see that like sort of helps is in place within the car to assist the driver and keep them from getting into an accident. Past that, there's the automotive SPICE for cybersecurity, and SPICE stands for the Software Process Improvement and Capability Determination, and this is used in a lot of different markets. And the automotive one basically requires manufacturers to identify and manage risks throughout the supply chain, instead of just looking at risks once you have a complete product or once you have all the pieces of a product put together. Because if you get parts from, let's say the Leahy Center gets parts, like they get their laptops from Dell, and the Leahy Center wants to stay compliant with the regulations that someone set forth from. They need to make sure that when Dell or whoever is making those laptops, that they are also staying compliant with the same regulations that the Leahy Center has to follow. So that just makes sure that even though companies are following standards, that there's not that sort of weakness where there's the guy making the laptops who doesn't follow the standards, and that leads to a vulnerability down the line for the company. And then finally on that chart, there's ISO 26262, which I talked about, which just talks a lot about the safety systems and like their electrical systems within automobiles. And that has to do a lot with the more things that sort of occur under the hood of the car, like in the background, that you won't even notice as a driver. So that's the wiring within the car that helps things run smoothly. And that'll be mentioned a little bit later on in my part, because there's actually something that just released in the news that has to do a lot with 26262, if you know about it. And there's obviously more than just these 5 regulations, but I think these are a good starting point for companies to follow. And Mike asked if these standards recently have been released or if they've been out for a while. And so it's kind of a good mix, because WP29 has been a group since probably early 2000s, but they've released a lot of those sections that I talked about earlier in about 2015, 2016. ISO 21434, on the other hand, is still being developed and hasn't even, they just released their second draft, I think, a little bit ago. And then other ones like the SAE J3061 and the other 2 on there, both released in about 2018, 2019. So there's a good spread of coverage, but definitely waiting for the ISO 21434 to release until like companies can actually be completely held accountable for like the regulations that they need to have in place and like to stay compliant. Because that one, as you can see from this chart, covers every single aspect of the sort of development chain that we see. And moving forward, talking about ISO 21434, like I said, it covers each and every aspect of production, and it sort of tailors each section to make sure that organizations are staying compliant. Phases 1 through 4 in there, you can't really see on this chart, but phases 1 through 4 focus a lot on the just giving like background information to the companies that are reading through the standard. And then phases 5 through 15 go over a lot of each stage of production. So like you'll see that there's stages about the processes that organizations need to take to manage their systems and their stages about the updates or incident response methods. And in addition to that, each of the stage has a section in it that focuses directly on cybersecurity and how companies need to be held accountable for that. But like I said, this is still being developed, so things can change and phases can get added onto it. And this is just sort of this sort of flow chart that you see on the screen is just sort of the baseline for what they're setting forth right now. So it starts with the initiation of a concept, and then the organization needs to define requirements that they know they'll need to achieve the goal that they want. Then they go about designing it and specifying the needs and sort of what it's capable of doing. And once they have that, they go about implementing it. And then from there, there's a lot of testing and denial and validation of the product. And then you move on to just having it approved and how it operates in the field. So that involves keeping it updated and keeping it secure, as well as having sort of protocols in place for what's going to happen once the product reaches its end of life cycle. So the company needs to know how they're going to remove that product from the market without causing issues with not only that product, but the other products that interconnect with it within the vehicle. So like I talked about, sections 5 through 15 cover the more meaty aspects of the regulations, whereas the first one just cover things like definitions or sort of terms you need to know in order to understand what they're talking about within the regulations. So I'll just briefly touch on some of the more important sections within the regulations. So like the segment 5 and segment 6 are fairly important. They kind of work together because 5 defines things that need to happen every single time for an organization to stay secure, and then 6 kind of digs down deeper into the actual product that's being designed at the moment and how sort of more things need to happen depending on what the company wants from that product or how they want to stay secure in terms of like manufacturing that product. 7 talks about how cybersecurity isn't just a one and done thing and how companies need to continuously work with a cybersecurity team to test and make sure that things aren't going to go wrong within their products. And another part of 7 kind of combined with it can be seen as number 8, which is risk assessment methods. And that just sort of defines how heavily stakeholders, which is the company as well as people who are invested and even the people driving cars day to day, how heavily they can be affected by scenarios that are found in like testing of the cybersecurity methods and stuff like that. 9 talks about how even from the stage of a concept of a product, so just an idea that cybersecurity needs to be thought about and that companies need to figure out what sort of flaws might be seen in the product from a really early stage. 10 and 11 talk about the development of it and the validation that needs to go with that, so sort of the upper end of the V that we saw in that last chart. And then we get into things like number 13, which is updates, how the company's going to handle that and how they're going to handle incident response. So when something goes wrong, what's their plan to actually go in and either fix it or figure out what exactly went wrong. And then 15 is another really important one that I touched on earlier, and it's distributed cybersecurity activities. It's covered up a little bit by the banner we have on the stream, but that talks about when an organization uses manufacturers outside of their local scope, like what steps does that person making the product for the organization need to follow in order to ensure that the organization as a whole is staying compliant with the regulation 21434. And that's really important, like I said earlier, just because if you have one piece of the puzzle that isn't staying up to date with cybersecurity it just allows a new hole for like attackers to look into sort of exploiting. So that's a pretty basic rundown of ISO 21434, which, as I said last stream and this stream, that's like going to be the standard for companies to really get, and if they don't get that, they're not going to be able to do the thing that they do, which is make cars, because this is going to be a sort of global like encompassing of every single like step of cybersecurity that needs to be followed, and it references other ISO standards just to make a really clear picture of what needs to happen with automobiles. And then just moving on, this was something that I found yesterday actually. A Tesla erupted in flames and the electronic doors within the car stopped working. And just based on like the stuff that I've been looking into, I immediately thought like that 26262, which is the regulation I was talking about earlier that talks about electronic systems in cars, that I feel like that should have had that covered, where if there is something that goes wrong mechanically or just electronically within the car, that the doors should have some type of fail-safe within them. And as it turns out, I did a little bit of digging, and as of 2018, Tesla, from what I found, does not have a sort of certificate of compliance as far as ISO 26262 goes, and that just means that they're sort of not, I don't want to like badmouth them and say they're cutting corners, but they're not taking all the steps that they should be in order to make sure that their vehicles are staying like really safe and really sort of secure. Because this guy, I think he broke the windshield and then had to climb out the front while the car was on fire because the doors wouldn't open because the wiring and the electrical components were burned.
Do we know if it was in like a newer or an older Tesla?
Yeah, so this was in the Model Plaid, the Model S in the Plaid trim is what they're calling it, and I think that just released like a month ago.
Okay, so
and
it's
I saw
not,
this
not
one
like
was
an outdated issue.
No. This was one of 250 cars that they shipped out. So I think they recalled all the other ones that they shipped out.
I would hope so.
Yeah, I would also hope so. So penalties for missing, Mike just had a quick question that says, what penalties are there for something like this? As far as 26262 goes, there are no penalties for not staying in compliance with this one because it's not seen as a mandatory thing. As far as I can see, the only regulation that will have penalties for missing is 21434, but that's not released yet. So as of right now, Tesla has, I guess, no real reason to go the extra step and be compliant with this one. Yeah, it's a good question, Mike, so thank you.
All right, AMSec. So not last week, 2 weeks ago, similar to what Will was talking about with compliance, I started talking about the CMMC from the Department of Defense and how additive manufacturers are going to have to prepare for that certification in order to continue operating and bidding on federal contracts. And one of the major aspects of that is vulnerability management. So I wanted to take some time to talk about kind of the real-world applications of risk management and vulnerability management. So this right here is essentially the vulnerability management cycle, and this applies to any company, not just additive manufacturers. This applies to any organization. So the steps are discover, assess, report, remediate, and verify. And I'll go into each of those right now. So discover is the first step, and this is before you even search for quote-unquote vulnerabilities. And what a vulnerability is essentially it could be an exploit, it could be just something being outdated that has some security issues. There's all sorts of things, anything that makes a device, a system, a network vulnerable to attacks from outside or inside the network that could kind of corrupts the whole supply chain. So the discovery step involves compiling your assets. I talked about 2 weeks ago as well how important it is to keep an inventory of all the systems in your organization, and this kind of goes into it. In order to really be able to gauge what vulnerabilities are out there or what you should be scanning for vulnerabilities, you kind of need to know what you have to work with. And there's also determining importance. So, for example, I'll give an example later on, but if you're looking at balancing risk and say you only have a certain amount of time, you're going to want to focus more on the crucial systems, such as those that are crucial for day-to-day operations, your financial department, anywhere you have intellectual property, as opposed to something like, someone who is in marketing. It might not be held as highly as something with intellectual property plans on it. So the next step is to assess these systems. So assessing is ensuring that all devices are scanned properly. I'll go over vulnerability scanners later on. There are many tools out there, many vulnerability scanners that will run surface level scans, or they can run elevated scans. And if you're not scanning things properly, say you just do a surface level, you could get some false reports back that say either this machine has crucial vulnerabilities on it and you have to do something about it, or it might say that this machine's perfectly fine when in reality beneath the surface it isn't. So you want to make sure that everything is scanned properly and that you're actually getting a good look at everything in your organization. And then, kind of like I said about determining importance of systems, you also want to determine the importance and prioritize individual vulnerabilities. A lot of scanners have it on a 0 to 5 or a 1 to 10 scale, where zeros, ones, lower vulnerabilities may not be as crucial, and you kind of have to balance that risk, and it might not be worth either sacrificing a certain budget or sacrificing having to go through downtime in the operation cycle to take care of those vulnerabilities. But if it's something like a very severe vulnerability that needs to be taken care of immediately, then you might have to just bite the bullet and shut down for an hour, 2 hours, whatever it takes to remediate that. So after you figure out what those vulnerabilities are, the next step is a report. And this is a customized report. Again, a lot of these tools will let you create these custom reports in them. So it's not as time consuming as you might think. But essentially it'll have recommendations and triage plans for any major vulnerabilities, as well as having these step-by-step actions for remediation and how to patch these vulnerabilities, whether it's as simple as just downloading a security update or if something needs to be reconfigured. And when you have this report, not only is it good to go back and look, should this vulnerability become something that's more of an issue in the future, you can say like, hey, this is the actions that we gave you. Why wasn't it done, or was it done properly? And it's also just good to give to the person that will be doing the remediation, whether it's an IT help desk, whether it's a networking engineer, a security operations engineer, anything like that. And the fourth step is remediate, which, as it sounds, you're remediating the vulnerability. So you're going to, through your ticket management system, you can assign tickets, manage expectations. Some large-scale vulnerabilities may need to be taken care of by multiple departments. You might have to have IT help desk working with the network operations center. You might need to hire a security engineer from a consulting company. You might need to go to a vendor and talk to them because maybe the vulnerability is on their end and it's something out of your control. So sometimes there's a lot more that goes into it. The example I'm going to give next is very basic and something that happens in-house, and it's something that happens a lot from day-to-day operations at most companies. But sometimes you're going to have to manage those expectations and kind of build a hierarchy system there. And then the last step is verify. So once it's remediated, it's reported that it's been remediated, it should be fine. You're going to do a second scan. It's kind of cut off there. And ensure that mitigation, that remediation is successful. You don't want to just, take someone's word for it and say, hey, we did exactly what you said. Because even if they did, there's no really telling that the options that you gave, or maybe if you look online, you look through different things like CVE, you look at different recommendations from other security professionals. There's no real way of knowing that would be 100% successful until you run that secondary scan to make sure that vulnerability doesn't trip again. And you're also going to want to analyze how the attack surface has changed. So for example, if you have a major system with a major vulnerability, that is a huge attack surface that will most likely be targeted by someone. And when you're doing these quarterly reviews, and whether you're reporting to C-level executives or whether you're reporting to stakeholders, whatever it is, it's nice to be able to say, like, okay, we had this, major system with intellectual property on it that had a few high-level vulnerabilities. We took care of it as stated in our CMMC certification. I believe in CMMC, I think it's with high-level vulnerabilities, you have 30 days to remediate, and with minors, you have 90 days to remediate, something like that. It's explicitly written out. Here's what we did. We took care of those vulnerabilities, so now our attack surface has shrunk significantly. And that's not only good for company image and for financial success, but it's also just good to know that you can now shift focus to these to the attack surface that is still present and not the ones that you've taken care of already. So this is just a little example that I set up. So on the left here, this is a vulnerability scanner. It's an actual system or a server that will sit on your network. It can come from all sorts of different vendors. Sometimes it's hardware based. They send you a literal vulnerability server that's completely intellectual property of theirs that you pay for. And sometimes it's software based, where you set up your own server and then you put their suite in. We can go over that a little later. And then over here, for example, it's kind of cut off there, but we have, say, a workstation in the finance department. This is just, on the floor of your organization. This is just someone's daily workstation. Then in the bottom left, you have your IT security team. For example, it could be a chief information security officer and a security engineer, or, sometimes you have specific risk analysts specifically for IT. And then on the bottom right, you have your IT help desk, which is, your team of IT help desk technicians. So with vulnerability management, it's a very proactive technique rather than reactive. You're going to constantly be scanning, whether it's for larger corporations, it can be multiple times a day, once a day. For some organizations, they do it once a week. So say we just say this workstation in finance has just been installed. It's a new workstation that we had in the closet. We set it up for the new hire, and she started working, and she's sitting there doing her day-to-day operations. Nothing's wrong on her end, and then it comes time for our weekly vulnerability scan. So IT security, who is in charge of this vulnerability management scanner, they're going to launch a scan, and it's going to scan an elevated scan on the network, which essentially gives it administrative rights, and it goes in through everything, it tests things, and it's not intrusive, so it's not going to take down any systems, or it's not like a pen test or anything. It's simply gathering information rather than actually performing actions on those machines. So eventually it goes through every single machine, and it hits this new finance machine, because when you set up the vulnerability scanner, you set up a IP window. So when IT help desk set up this machine, it fell in that window. So the scanner is like, hey, here's a new one, let's add it to the scan. So from there, it's then going to report back all the findings. And the scans can be very quick, or they could take up to 2 hours even, depending on how many assets you have. So say after the 2-hour window, it comes back and it hits you with this right here, which is, for example, 5 out of 5, an end-of-life or obsolete operating system error. Microsoft Windows XP detected. So this PC that we had in the closet, it's an old PC, it has Windows XP, something like that, something that's completely obsolete and has lots of security issues. We don't want someone in our financial department working with that. And the vulnerability scanner, the vendor knows that end-of-life obsolete systems are some major issues, so it's decided to mark that as a level 5. So then that report is given back to whoever is running the scan from IT security side, and they then give that report to IT help desk. They outline, okay, on this particular machine, it's an end-of-life obsolete OS. Here's what you need to do. Ensure it's upgraded to, a baseline minimum, Windows 10 or, coming up soon, Windows 11, whatever it is that you've outlined in your security process. Mike asked, for the severity, does the scanner make the call, or does the company make the decision of how severe a vulnerability is? I would say 99% of the time it's based on what the scanner says. So the scanner does specifically have vulnerability outlines, and a lot of these are based on CVE levels, if these are known vulnerabilities. Otherwise, there are some companies that have their own vulnerability database where they have specific risk analysts going through who make those educated decisions on whether or not something can be considered severe or not. But ultimately, the decision is up to the company. I know for one of the companies that I used to work at, we had in our policy specifically, if the vulnerability pops up as a 4 or a 5, no matter what, that is top priority. That's not something that CMMC specifically goes into, because CMMC doesn't really have a standard for what vendor you go for. Like I said, some vendors are 1 to 5. Some vendors use specific CVE numbers, so you can have like a vulnerability of a 7.2, which is different than a 7.3, and it gets kind of convoluted there. So it is up to the company in the end what they want to do. But 9 times out of 10, if it comes up as a 4 or a 5, for in this example, it is a serious issue, and it's not really up for interpretation. It's kind of a standardized serious issue. So after that report is given to help desk and it tells them what they need to do, they go work on the system, whether they upgrade it remotely, whether they go to the system itself. Sometimes they'll have to go into a network operations center. They might have to remote into it, whatever. But for this specifically, they're like, okay, we're just going to go over to the finance machine and we're going to install Windows 10, whatever, on it. And then they report back to IT security, say, okay, we did what you wanted. It can be done, something like this can be done in an hour. It's not something that you're going to really have to open that many tickets for. So this is why I said it's a more simplistic example. So IT security is like, all right, let's go into the next step after remediation, which is then verification. So they access the scanner again, and this time this is an on-demand scan for verification purposes. So this is not falling within their weekly schedule. They specifically shrunk that down. They said, okay, we're going to access the scanner. We're going to do an on-demand scan, and we want you to only scan this system because this is the one that we want to verify worked. And that cuts it down significantly. That goes from like a 2-hour scan to like a 2-second scan. So then they scan that machine again, and then it returns, with zeros, and it says no vulnerabilities detected, and that's then verified, and that's how you know that, okay, the remediation worked. We'll put that into the report, and then we'll move on to the next vulnerability that popped up. So this is a very simple example, but it kind of goes through that whole 5-step process. And with most organizations, you're going to have to amplify this. You can have anywhere from 20 to 30 level 5s per scan. Some of them might just be ignored due to the systems being less important, to them not being real attack vectors, if they're segmented, stuff like that. But hopefully this kind of helps visualize it a little better. All right. I know Mike asked some questions, but if there's any other questions, you can type them into the chat. We can see it up here on the TV. I know I had a question for Will. So ISO.
Yeah.
Right. So CMMC and ISO. CMMC is based on ISO.
Yeah.
And obviously, additive manufacturing, car manufacturing is a little bit different. So, what question I did have is this? What was the number? Is it
21434? The one that's not released.
So that's the one that's not released yet.
Yeah.
And is that just a framework, or is that something that is going to have like a certification body that's...
Yeah, so it's gonna have a certification. There's gonna be like audits that go along with it, and that's sort of, I think, their main way of testing if companies are following it is with sort of an audit system.
Yeah. Okay. So
I think a lot of ISO standards do that sort of thing.
Yeah. Does it have is there like a timeline on when they're hoping to launch it?
So I think they said mid 2021, but considering we're at mid 2021, I think it's gonna be pushed back a little bit.
Right. So companies can still prepare for it, which is essentially what I'm doing for my client is helping them prepare for CMMC because that was supposed to come out 2 years ago.
A little bit more behind schedule.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's sort of a pairing with ISO 21434 that's ISO 5112. That's like the guideline for cybersecurity engineering. Mm-hmm. So that's like the guideline half. If you consider like ISO 21434 a regulation, then 5112 is like the guideline for it. So companies are starting to look at that draft and become like compliant with that guideline, because that'll set them up well for when the other one actually releases.
So 21434, that's something that applies to all automobile manufacturers, or is it just a U.S. thing? It's a
thing within I know that the EU is looking at it, U.S., Canada, all the major companies that have automobile manufacturers based within them.
Gotcha.
Is gonna look at that as a standard.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. That'll be exciting.
Yeah.
Maybe less exploding Teslas.
Maybe, hopefully. For you though, is that so? You talked about vulnerability scanners, that they come in sort of hardware and software. Mm-hmm. Do companies define what they're looking for, or are they able to add on to like the suite of things that the vulnerability scanner is looking for?
Yeah, so I think it mostly just depends on, it's like a competitive kind of thing. Just like when you're looking at any really security product for an organization, there's all sorts of things. There's like some of the companies I can think of are like Qualys, there's Nessus, there's Tenable, there's Freight, there's countless. I think it's I forget what the name of the company is that they do. I don't know if you've ever seen them. They do like quadrants, and then they have up and comers and leaders on the left and right axis, and then they have on the
y-axis.
On the y-axis they have I forget what it is, but essentially they map out all these different products, and then it kind of goes into like, okay, so this one's an industry leader, but this one's going to save you a little bit money and still have the same kind of thing. So
that's pretty cool.
Yeah, there's all sorts of different financial things that go into it. Security is one of the only business expenses that you get no real return out of. Just because you're more secure, it's not going to generate profit. It's just going to stop you from losing.
That's why a lot of companies don't get security things until it actually comes about and hurts them.
Yep, that is the case.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any questions before we...
Any final thoughts from the chat coming in?
Mike says very cool. Thank you, Mike. I'm glad you enjoyed it, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, if that's it, then...
Yeah, I think we're good.
Thank you guys for watching. As always, you can check out MCSP and the Leahy Center on LinkedIn, as well as a couple other social media platforms. I think everything's in the description for the stream.
Everything is in the stream description. Our individual LinkedIn, as well as the MCSP website. I do know there are a few people last time that, because we kind of glossed over it, that asked, what is MCSP? So that stands for Munich Cyber Security Program. And it's a subsidiary of ComCode, which is, our employers in Germany. So hopefully that clears some things out. But if you're curious about that, everything is listed down in the description. So you can go check that out. Check out our blogs. We do blogs that go along with these streams that kind of go a bit more in depth about what we're doing in the project. And then next week, I don't know who specifically will be on the stream, but I do know it'll be, at the very least, Mike for MedSec. And then, is it Ian? Okay, so Ian for DFIR. We'll be talking about that.
Yeah, so that should be interesting. And that there'll be a notification going out on LinkedIn for that too, sometime mid next week.
Yes, we might have to switch some things around. I think going forward, the streams are going to be a little bit earlier in the day, not 1 p.m. But any changes obviously will be in those LinkedIn posts.
Yeah.
All right.